right, let's open up to Judges 17. Judges chapter 17. Get this on. Okay, so this is a short chapter, but chapter 17 and 18 go together. This has to do with Micah and, idolatry, and of course that Levite we were talking a little bit about there, and pew packers. But there's really a double conclusion, chapter 17 and 18, and then 19 to 20, toward the end of 21. With the beginning one here, the ones we're going to start with tonight, it has a lot to do with idolatry, whereas the last other chapters are more about the moral degradation of going downhill and getting a snapshot of just how bad things have gotten in the land of Israel. And we see that phrase and quite a bit. Every man did what was right in his own eyes in 17:6, 21:25, and in other places as well. And then also that phrase, in those days there was no king in Israel. When you hear that phrase, everyone did what was right in his own eyes, I mean, we know what that means. That means we do what we think is right. But why is that a significant phrase in the Bible? Okay, it is a warning. That is true. It's showing the direction they're moving in. When we look at the law, especially when Moses gets on the scene, what do we see God constantly telling Israel again and again through Moses? What does he want them to do? Yeah, be obedient. Moses calls on Israel several times to do what is right in the sight of the Lord. And that word sight, as the New American Standard translates it, is eyes, in his eyes. Do what is right in his eyes. And through Judges, it seems to be more about what they're doing right in their own eyes. And then that phrase, in those days there was no king in Israel. Why is that significant? And why is that? Why does the writer feel like he needs to say that? Okay. No government. Okay.
There weren't laws, essentially.
Well, okay, yeah, there wasn't a guidance system, although there was. What was the guidance system they should have been paying attention to? God, the Levitical priesthood, but then we see this. We see one who's not doing so good, but we'll look a little bit more at him here in a moment. But a king would also guide the nation, would he not? Did God ever intend Israel to have a king? I see a few people shaking their head no. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Just hold your finger there in Judges and look at Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 to the end of the chapter, verse 20. It says, "When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Now it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel." Interesting. And that's with Moses under the law when he said this. And some of those things that God brings out, it's as if God knows exactly what's coming. When you say, we want to have a king like all the other nations, and will they eventually say that? They will. And then he warns, don't put a foreigner over you. Does Israel always generally go to, not always, but do they generally go to other kingdoms or nations to protect them? When they were told, don't go to the Egyptians, don't go to the Assyrians, look to God, but they do. Or maybe don't accumulate for yourselves wives, lest you be carried away. Who does that sound like? Solomon. You can see the warnings. God knows what's going to happen. And I like that at the end he says, and the king, when he sits on his throne, is to write out a copy of the law in front of the Levitical priest. How many kings do you think actually did that? I don't know. We don't have a record of it. But if anyone did, who do you think would have done it? David. I agree, David. He would have done it. And that's probably why he was a man after God's own heart, because he really had a very humble heart. And as a, well, I know, but I'm just saying we don't know who. But ultimately, God knew they were going to ask for a king, and then explained to them, here's what you're going to do, and what you're going to look for, what that king needs to do. And of course, there's going to be more stipulations later on. But back over here in Judges, there was no king. Everyone was doing their own thing. And so they were not listening to the voice of God. And so we see this religious decline of Israel, especially here in chapters 17 and 18. We see it's got a lot to do with idolatry, and of course the improper way the Levite is working out in this as well. And another thing I think is interesting is that it starts off, now there was a man of the hill country of Ephraim. Ephraim seems to be a pretty significant focal point throughout the book of Judges. I just find that to be interesting. And in verse 2, it says, Micah, he said to his mother, the 1,100 pieces of silver which were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse in my hearing, behold, the silver is with me. I took it. And his mother said, blessed be my son by the Lord, all caps, Yahweh. He then returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, I wholly dedicate the silver from my hand to the Lord for my son, to make a graven image and a molten image. Now, therefore, I will return them to you. So when he returned the silver to his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave them to the silversmith, who made them into a graven image and a molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household idols, and consecrated one of his sons that he might become his priest. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. So what sticks out as interesting in those first 6 verses?
I have a question. Is the 1,100 pieces of silver, sounding like what the reward for Delilah was?
That is true. It was 1,100. There are some who think that this could be Delilah, different places. Maybe she had moved, the mother, but I don't know. I don't think it is. But I don't think, whether it is or it isn't, the focus here is on Micah and what he's doing and the idolatry. I think it's interesting that he creates an ephod. I think it's interesting they use the term Yahweh. I think it's interesting that he takes one of his sons and fills his hand, consecrates him to be one of his priests. I think all those things are vastly interesting. Why? What does it tell you? What does he know? Like, how does he know what an ephod is? Well, yeah, he knows some things. They use the name Yahweh. They know about priests, and he recognized a Levite, a Levitical priest, but they don't apparently know enough about what all these things mean, because toward the end, we'll see at the end of the chapter, he says, now I know that the Lord, Yahweh, will prosper me, seeing that I have a Levite as a priest. And so he wants to do the right thing. He wants to be religious, but how hard is he looking at what God wants him to do? Not at all. And so why his son? Why make his son a priest? And now when he says, I will, where does he say that? I thought it said here. I misread that. That's later on. consecrate his son, that he might become his priest. Oh, that's right. Right. That's I'm thinking it's the Levite. So, but still, he makes his son a priest, which is, I think, strange, but he does. And so the story continues in verse 7. Now there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he was staying there. Then the man departed from the city, from Bethlehem in Judah, to stay wherever he might find a place. And as he made his journey, he came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah. Micah said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I am a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to stay wherever I may find a place." Micah then said to him, "Dwell with me, and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, a suit of clothes, and your maintenance." So the Levite went in. The Levite agreed to live with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will prosper me, seeing that I have a Levite as priest." So you have this Levite. He's living in Bethlehem. There's 2 Bethlehems. This one's in Judah. Anyone know, is that one of the Levitical cities that the Levites are to stay and work in or be in? It is not. That is not where he is supposed to be. There's nothing wrong with him traveling around and going around, but he's clearly staying there. And when he asked where he's from, he says he's from Bethlehem of Judah. That's not where he should be from. That's wrong. It's also interesting that the text says he's a young man. Now that's subjective. How old is he? Well, in order to begin the priestly duties, you got to be over 25 years of age to start your priestly duties. My guess is that he's probably either not old enough or he's just hit that age, and then he leaves, looking for a place where he can be or stay. And I get the feeling that the text is pointing to the idea that he's not doing well. Because again, how many people know a lot about God in his word? Micah knows a little, but it looks like Israel's moving away from that, and so maybe the Levites aren't getting the kind of support they need. Because how much land do the Levites own? None. How do they support themselves? Okay, what's that? Tithings, mainly from the tithing. It has a few fields here and there, but they didn't have much. And so if Israel is not engaged with them in tithing, that's right, they're not getting anything. So maybe that's what's happening. I don't know. But maybe he went to Bethlehem trying to find some work. Things weren't looking good there, so he moves on, and he comes across Micah, who offers him a pretty sweet deal. He says, "Man, I can live with that." And so he becomes his priest. What's wrong with that? Okay, that's right. Can't actually perform all his duties at Micah's house or to an idol. That's right. We're going to find out next week in chapter 18. He still had them. They were still in there. And he's a personal priest to one person, one man. Can't do that. This isn't how it works. And so you even see the Levitical priest going out looking to make, I'm assuming, to make ends meet, and he just takes whatever job he finds, and he just does it. He just doesn't seem to have any problem with it at all in my mind as he moves from place to place. And he comes across Micah, who also gets excited about it and says, "Boy, come on in. I'm glad to have you be part of this." And he even believes at the very end that the Lord, now I know that the Lord will prosper me, seeing I have a Levite as priest. Isn't that interesting? Apply that to today. Do people say that sort of thing like that Micah does at the very end, verse 13? Do they say that today? Oh, man, yeah, all the time. Oh, look at all the people in attendance with our congregation. I know I'm doing the right thing because look how the Lord has blessed us with all this attendance. Or I think it was Rubel Shelley. When he decided to leave the Church of Christ, he said he was at a funeral, And he heard a man who was a denominational preacher give a prayer at a funeral, and he said, I can't believe that anyone who could give such a beautiful prayer not be in a right relationship with the Lord. And that was one of his reasonings, because it sounded so good. In other words, he was saying, I know the Lord is with him. Did you hear that prayer? Is that true? If someone gives a very good prayer, does that make them in a right relationship with God? What about a very good person? I mean, very, like Mother Teresa good. Does that make them, put them in a right relationship with God? It doesn't. Now, why not? Did Mother Teresa do good? Well, she did a lot of good, especially to children. And she went all over the world. She sacrificed a lot to help people. How can you say she is not going to go to heaven? Or how could you assume, I should say, that she would not be going to heaven? Did she follow God's will? I think that's the right question to ask. God knows. She knows. It's up to him. But she's so good, right? Doesn't that count for something? As Paul puts it in the book of Romans, God is the potter, we are the clay. All humanity is one lump of clay, and God will make from it what? Vessels for honor, vessels for dishonor. And the clay doesn't say to the potter, why did you make me this way? It can't. However you're made, whatever you are, that's what he made. And now what are you going to do with it? You may not have all the talents this person has. You may not have all the opportunities that person has, but you were made, and now what are you going to do? That's right. Trying to find this verse in chapter 18 that goes along with what you're saying. I got to find it. In chapter 18, when the Danites are taking the Levitical priest because of the where is it? Because of the idols, they were taking the idols. Oh, yeah, it's in verse 30. The sons of Dan set up for themselves the graven image, and Jonathan, that's the Levite, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. It's interesting that connection is made there with the idols and the captivity, because that's what God says. If you do this, I'm going to send you off into captivity, all throughout Deuteronomy and other places, and that's exactly right. And yet here we are, the very opening of chapter 17, it's idols. But and this is just one event. And I think the writer put it here so we could see, here's what's going on in Israel. So here's one event, and I think this is the general snapshot of the land. And then after chapter 18, verses 19, or chapters 19, 20, and 21, what is that? Do you remember what happens in those chapters? How bad is it in those? The moral derogation of that is straight down. It is horrible, horribly bad. And we're going to go through it. It's pretty rough. But it's a snapshot of what life was like in Israel. Because in those days, there was no king. There was no one to push people to go in a particular direction. Because isn't it interesting when we would read through 1st, 2nd Kings, you get a good king, and how would things go in Israel? It would go well. And the people would listen, and they would follow that king. But then immediately he would die, and then the son would come up, and they would be an evil king, and how bad would things go in Israel? People would follow them, and they would do what he said. So these kings had a great power of being able to direct the masses in different directions. But you got good kings, you got bad kings, but ultimately they all sinned, didn't they? How many of them were the kind of king we needed? None of them. None of them could do it. We needed the Christ. But here in chapter 17, we have, the danger of self-deception. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, and who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." It's pretty clear what Isaiah's point is there in 5:20, that just because somebody renames an evil act as good doesn't mean it's good, does it? It's still evil. People can walk around the darkness and proclaim that they are the light, but that doesn't change the journey or the darkness that they're in. It's still the same. But even though it was happening then, back then, it still happens today in our country or in our society, doesn't it? I mean, I really thought when I first got here, I talked a lot about how, it's coming when people they'll call evil good and good evil, but I thought it was a long way off. I really did. I'm shocked at what people are saying is okay and acceptable. It blows my mind. And I know I've mentioned this before, but it's just, I always think about that, especially now with my dad and his situation, where he told me, when this was back in the early 90s, and we were talking about the music I listened to, and he saw the videos of music videos, and he says, one day, son, they're going to be doing this, that, and the other, and they're putting bones in their nose. People are going to start putting bones in their nose. And I laughed. No, Dad, that is so dumb. No one's going to do that. Well, I was wrong. Now I feel like I'm my dad. I always tell my kids the same thing. I don't know what they could possibly come up with next. But how did we get here? How did this happen? What was that, Harry? TikTok. That's right. Yeah, TikTok videos. I agree. Those TikTok videos, things like that. But looking at the passage of Judges, what's the correlation? What are we missing? We have no king in the land. That's right. And everyone did what was right in their own eye. They didn't reject you. They rejected me. That's right. That's right. That's what we were saying just a moment ago. Isaiah was pointing out that because someone renames evil act as good, it may not be good at all. And that's what we're seeing going on here in chapter 17 and 18. Allowing the world, as you're saying, to have more influence than the Word of God always leads to a self-deception. Yes, David was a good king, but as we already said, could he lead us where we needed to be? Just because he was a good king doesn't mean he was the best king or the king we needed. Because he did sin. He did create problems. He did create civil war. And there were a whole host of good kings, but ultimately, where did it go for Israel? Captivity. It was to show we can't do it. And Tim was right. We couldn't do it. The law was there to show we can't do it. We had the kings. We tried the judges. We tried the kings. We tried all these things, and none of it got us where we needed to be because everyone kept trying to rely on themselves. And in our country, there is no king in the sense that there's no one leading in a direction we need to go. And so we look to our government, or we look to our president, or we look to the preacher. And all these things in order to rest our salvation on these men or these things or whatever it might be. But if you rest your salvation on me, how well will that go for you? Because as we know, I'm never wrong, right? Well, I can be wrong. I'm man. So who do you rest your salvation on? It's Christ. And as we've said so many times from this pulpit, not just me, but Alex and others, you have to know what the Word says. If you really want to be able to look out there into the world or whatever it is that you may be doing and recognize error when it crops up, then you need to know what the truth is. And if you do know the truth, you will always see that error. But we also learn from Micah's example that merely being religious is insufficient. And there's a lot of people who are being religious out there. He's got self-constructed objects of worship. He's got his self-appointed priest. He determined his religion was sufficient in his own mind. But this book of Judges is not a story of irreligious people. Most of the people in Judges are intensely religious, very much. And religion comes in many different versions, but they're not always or all genuine, and not all produce the expected good results. It continues to abound. Some offer beliefs and practices that bear little resemblance to the biblical faith. Others appear to be genuine, but close inspection will show otherwise. So what do? You got to dive deep for yourself. Get into the Word. And don't wait around thinking, man, you know what, this Chris guy isn't cutting it. And then some Levitical priest shows up who seems really smart. And man, he's got a this, that, or the other. And, well, we're going to kick Chris out. We're going to get this guy. This guy's going to make us so much better. What if you could get the best preacher in the world as far as truth goes, and you got him behind this pulpit? Would it change anything? Because who's got to change? You do. You got to make the choice. And I've often said I like to use the illustration of our country. It doesn't matter who we put in as the president in the United States. It won't matter. It's not going to change the direction. Because only one thing can. You have to change the heart of the people. You got to have a heart of a desire to know God and change who you are. It has to begin there. You can hear all the right stuff all day long, and it won't make a bit of difference until you are wanting to change from the inside. Yeah, it's the motivation of that. Yeah, because that's what God was saying in the Deuteronomy chapter 14 when he says, when you do ask for a king, here's what the king needs to be. Okay, how much better, I shouldn't say good, how much better would the king be if they did have the attitude God laid out there in 14? And when they sat down on the throne, copied out the law in front of the Levitical priesthood, and then made that their focus, they would be a much better king. Would they be perfect? No. But you would find more Davids than you would Ahabs. That's for sure. But God knew they were going to look for a king and expected it. He knew it was going to happen. He knows all things. But he wanted them to have the right attitude toward it. He knew they wouldn't, but he was preparing them for it. And just like why he said, and when you have a king, the king should not be accumulating himself wives, because they may lead him astray. Of all the people who should have known that passage, Solomon would have. Smartest guy in the world. And yet he did it. He did it anyway. Because we're mere men. We can't rely on ourselves. You can't rely on me. In this case, you need to rely on the Word and trust in God. And if you don't, we see where it leads. We see it in the book of Judges. We can see it in our own society. So what do? It always starts. This is the only way I see in Scripture of changing a society. You change yourself. And then you begin to try to affect the people who are the nearest to you, of whom you can affect. And if we all did that, and we were trying to that extent, we were able to convert a few people to that truth, that could spread. But how many people have ears to hear? How many people have eyes to see? And why don't they want to? Was there any prophet in the Old Testament who could not convert anybody, could not bring anyone to the truth? Jeremiah. He struggled with that. No one would listen. God told Isaiah, I want you to go preach to those people, but they're not going to listen to you, but you're going to preach anyway. You're going to give them the opportunity. No matter what happens, no matter how things are going in this world, we ought to always be that light and be that salt. That's the purpose of the book of Daniel. That's the purpose of the book of Revelation, to show that even when things look like everything's going to fall apart and that you're losing and the world's winning, take heart. God's already won. You've already won. Just keep on keeping on. Stand firm in Christ and don't give up. Jonah got mad when they did. I know. I love that story. But we can't get upset. Can't allow the emotions to overtake us. We just got to keep trying. Trust in the Lord. I mean, I'm not happy with the direction of our country. I want things to change. But I know what I can do. And I know that God has all the power, and so does his word. Because it's not in me, it's in him, and him alone. It's a good study. We're going to continue on in chapter 18 next week. I hope you can be here for that.